As we make our composition book cover, let's first start by cutting out our pieces. The first thing you need is an 11 by 16.5 inch rectangle, and this will be the inside of your cover. You also need 2 rectangles that are 11 by 5.5 inches. These will be the flaps on the inside cover. Next, you need 2 7 by 11 inch rectangles, and these rectangles will be used for the outside of the cover. For the spine, you're going to want a 4 3/8 inch rectangle by 11 inches. And for the pocket, you're going to want another 7 by 11 inch rectangle. You want to use interfacing on the spine piece. This is the 4 3/8 by 11 inch rectangle. And you want to use interfacing on the 2 exterior edges. So these are the 2 7 by 11 inch rectangles. So the first thing we're going to do is cut interfacing the same size as these 3 rectangles and fuse it following our manufacturer's instructions. I'm going to be using a simple featherweight fusible interfacing. So let's go to the ironing board. When you fuse interfacing to fabric, make sure that the fabric is right side down. Place the rough side of the interfacing, the glue side, so that the rough side is touching the wrong side of your fabric. And then press. Trim off any interfacing that extends beyond the edge of your fabric. Next, we're going to prepare the pocket. So take your 7 by 11 inch rectangle, the one that you didn't use for the outside cover, and we're going to fold it in half so that the wrong sides are touching. Line up those edges. The pocket will be oriented this way, so our pocket size is now 5.5 by 7. And go ahead and press it in half. And now we're going to mark where we want our pocket divisions to be. There's going to be a 1/2 inch seam allowance on each side. So when I draw my pocket lines, I want to take that into account. I want each pocket to be 1 inch wide. So on the sides, on the left and the right, I'm going to put a line 1.5 inches from the edge. I'm going to do the same on the other side, 1.5 inches from the edge. Because the seam is going to come right here, which will leave another inch for the channel. And then in between here, I'm going to divide into 1 inch increments. Now, you don't have to divide your pockets like this. You can divide your pockets any way you want. So if you'd like some bigger, some smaller, you can change this. But I'm doing mine 1 inch wide. Take one of your 7 by 11 inch rectangles, the one that you'd like to be on the front cover, and lay it flat right side up. Take your pocket piece and line it up with the bottom edge. Also line up the sides. And we are going to baste this in place with a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around those 3 sides. This side will remain open because it's a pocket. Now that my pocket's attached, I'm ready to sew the channels. So I have this line here and all the others that need to be stitched to create the pockets. There's a few ways you can do this. For added strength, you can use a triple stitch and start here and stop here, and that will make a really strong, secure channel. The way I like to do it is I like to start stitching at the bottom of the line, go all the way to the top, put my needle down, turn, and then go back. So I'm going to start here, sew up, and back. Start here, sew up, and back. And I'm going to repeat the process for each of my pocket divisions. So now that the pocket's done, we're ready to start with the spine. So take your rectangle that we've just put together, and we're going to attach it to the spine piece. So lay this front piece right side up. Take your spine piece. This is the one that's the same color as my pocket. And this is the 4 3/8 by 11 inch rectangle. And we're going to place this right side down along the left-hand side of our cover. And we're going to sew this along this edge with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. As you're sewing this project, you want to be really careful with your seam allowance size. Each machine is different, but usually somewhere on the presser foot or on the plate, you're going to see guides for your seam allowances. So this project uses mostly a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So make sure that you know where that reference point is on your machine so that you can make sure your seam sizes are exact. If your sizes aren't exact, it's possible that your cover won't fit. So take care and make sure to follow the seam allowances as exactly as possible. Now that the spine is attached, with the seam allowance pointing to the left, fold the spine away from the cover and press. I like to gently pull the spine fabric away so that I can make sure that it lays nice and flat. And now I'm ready to add the back cover. So I'm going to take my back cover piece and I'm going to turn it right side down, and I'm going to align it along the left-hand edge of my spine piece. And again, I'm going to sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. My back cover is now attached, and so now I want to press again. When I press this time, I want to make sure that the seam allowance is pointing towards the spine. Now that the spine's been attached to the front and the back cover, we want to top stitch the seam allowances in place. So on each side here on the spine section, we're going to sew with an 1/8 inch seam allowance, holding those seam allowances here in place to give it a nice flat look for our cover. Okay. My front cover and back cover are now attached to the spine. You'll notice on my project that I did use contrasting thread. My white thread here is very bright and vibrant against my fabric, which means my stitches show up a lot. If you want your stitches to blend in and you don't want to see these as much, try using a coordinating thread when you sew your top stitching. We're going to set the cover aside for a second, and we are going to prepare the fabric for the flaps. The first thing you want to do is take one of your flap pieces, this is the 5.5 by 11 inch rectangle, and we are going to fold over one long edge. So I've got it facing right side down on my ironing board. I'm going to take one long edge and I'm going to fold it over 1/4 inch and press. Now that same edge, I'm going to fold over one more time. About the same width, maybe just a smidge bigger. And press. Okay. And we're going to repeat that on the other rectangle on the opposite side. And now we're going to stitch these in place. We're going to stitch these folds flat using a seam allowance that's just smaller than 1/4 inch. So let's go to the sewing machine. Press the fold flat again. Let's attach the flaps. First, lay your cover right side up. Then take one of your flap pieces and lay it right side down along the right hand side. Line up the top, side, and the bottom, and make sure that the edge that you've finished, the folded edge, is pointing towards the spine. Take your other rectangle and do the same thing on the left-hand side. Line up the top, the side, and the bottom, and make sure the folded edge is here. So let's sew. We're gonna sew the top, sides, and bottom. We're gonna baste it in place with 1/4 inch seam allowance. My flaps are now attached, and now I'm ready to add the last piece, which is the inside cover. So you're going to take your inside cover piece and you're going to lay it right side down on top of the others. Now, both of these pieces should be the same size now, so it should all be 16.5 by 11. If it's not 16.5 by 11, you're going to want to center the pieces and trim it so that it is, because it is important that it be the right size. So now I'm going to go ahead and pin this in place. Okay, I'm going to sew around the edges of my cover, but I'm going to make sure I leave an opening. You want the opening to be about 3 to 4 inches wide. So I'm going to mark it with different colored pins. I'm going to start at my green pin and I'm going to stop at my purple pin here, and I'm going to leave this section open. So I'm going to start, down, and stop. And I'm going to sew this with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Clip the 4 corners. Take care not to cut your stitches. And now find your opening and reach inside and pull out the inside. You may want to use a corner turner or some other tool to help flatten out those corners on the edge. Okay. Lay your project flat. Make sure those side seams are all the way pushed out. And now we're ready to press. My opening is now closed, and again, if you prefer not to hand stitch, you can sew that by machine with a small seam allowance. When I left my opening, I left it on the top of the cover. If I was gonna sew this by machine, I would have preferred to do it on the bottom edge, just so that stitching isn't quite so noticeable. So it's time to insert our notebook. This cover fits most standard 9 3/4 by 7.5 inch notebooks. Just go ahead and open up the front cover and slide it into the front flap. Sometimes this can take a little wiggling. Next, you're going to take the back cover and slide it into the back pocket. Sometimes you do need to arch the spine a bit. Slide it on in. Make sure it lays nice. The seam allowances should be pressing next to the front cover, so your flap should lay nice and smooth. Same with the other side, and you now have a nice cover for your notebook, and it's all ready to store your pens and pencils. The inside.